Yeah, good afternoon, dear students, dear colleagues, dear guests. I would like to welcome you to today's book presentation and discussion organized by myself in the framework of my course Scripts of Anti-Racism, and also in cooperation with Decoloniality Now Collaborative Research Initiative and Global Studies Program at the University of Freiburg. So Benjamin Davis is our guest today. Thank you for accepting my invitation, Ben. Um, Ben is an assistant professor of Africana Studies and Hispanic Studies at Texas A&M University in the United States of America. He is also a fellow at the Center on Modernity in Transition, so you can check their website. Benjamin will deliver a talk on his recently published book, Another Humanity, Decolonial Ethics from Bois to Arendt. So we will hear in a couple of minutes how in this book Benjamin defends the concepts of the human and humanity against a critical backdrop in theory today. Before that, Benjamin's first book, Simone Weil's Political Philosophy, field notes from the margins. So in this first book, he presents the mystic Simone Weil as a key political theorist. And then his second book, Choose Your Bearing, Edouard Glissant, Human Rights and Decolonial Ethics. And here in the second book, he reads the poet Glissant as an important and insightful voice for the practice of human rights today. Among many other publications, in 2024, with Chris Seeley, he also edited an important book titled Creolizing Critical Theory, so New Voices in Caribbean Philosophy. The students of global studies will remember that last week we focused on the Caribbean. And some of his journal articles, such as What Could Human Rights Do? A Decolonial Inquiry, and the politics of positionality, so the difference between post, anti, and decolonial methods, are actually reflecting some of the common current topics that we also work in our research group at the University of Freiburg. So it is actually not easy for me to introduce such a productive colleague very shortly here, but now I think I should stop and I would like to invite Benjamin to deliver his talk. Please, Benjamin.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that generous introduction. And I want to thank Professor Chelik for this invitation. I will say at the beginning that to everyone that I heard about this work being done around decoloniality and global studies at Freiburg after reading Professor Chelik's recent essay in the publication Open Global Rights about academic freedom. And in that essay, as many of you may already know, he argues that real academic solidarity is more than just finding ways to fund scholars in need, though that is important, but it's also about defending norms and standards and maybe most of all human rights. So it strikes me that being with you here this afternoon and this invitation to do so is itself one of these acts of solidarity, given the controversial nature of my book, Another Humanity. So in that spirit, I'm especially grateful to be with all of you today. I also want to say as we begin that I find this work being done around decoloniality now and global studies so important. I know one of your previous speakers, Manisha Desai, and I really respect her work and her mind. So I'm honored to be in this list of speakers. As I just mentioned, I was reading through what I could find online about your Decoloniality Now project and your focus on asymmetries that still mark political and academic life. And I was just, before we started the call, Professor Chelik and I were talking about traveling recently. We were both traveling. I was just in Rwanda, and talking to colleagues there, I'm reminded of how difficult it still is for African scholars to get visas to travel to Europe and North America. So I just want to note this asymmetry as one of these asymmetries that affect our research as we begin. I see your initiative also has connections on the continent in South Africa and Ghana, if I read that correctly. So that's important. Okay, let me talk a little bit about the book. As you know from the subtitle, I end the book with a chapter on Hannah Arendt. And so it's fitting to be with all of you, at least virtually today in Freiburg, where Arendt spent some of her student life. And I'll return to this sense of student life and her theme of intellectual friendship at the end of my little talk, which will only last about 20-25 minutes, so we have time for conversation. Okay, so my book, Another Humanity, which while I've been in Black Studies departments, could be read as part of this wider conversation you all are developing in global studies. One aspect of global studies I find so important is its insistence on interdisciplinary and international work, which shapes our questions. This is partly why I'm mentioning the question of visas to begin as well. And we are living in a time, as Professor Chelik's essay on academic freedom pointed out, that is trying to prevent us from asking certain kinds of questions and from thinking with some people. This, I think, is what violations of academic freedom most fundamentally are. Attempts to stop us from asking certain kinds of questions with some of our colleagues in other places. Sometimes these denials are written into law. We're seeing these debates in the US now around critical race theory in Palestine. And I know the German context to some extent is repressive in some questions. But sometimes also these denials are not written into law, but just culturally with us in creating an atmosphere of fear, as we've also been seeing in the past few years. Some of the most important questions or insights Hannah Arendt gave us are from Origins of Totalitarianism. What if the nation state is best understood not as something that protects our fundamental rights, but as something that denies them? And from her later correspondence with Karl Jaspers, what if universities are best understood not as places of radical thought, but too often as places where students learn to become professionals? So this brings me to the themes I want to talk about today: exile and student life, themes which have to do with some ways of doing decolonial theory at present, asking questions in decolonial theory, and I'll try to make this connection. The main interlocutor for these themes in my book is Edward Said, who taught Hannah Arendt in his courses on imperialism. I've spent time at Said's archive at Columbia, and he almost always included Arendt in these courses. He also, as some of you may know who know his work, he maintained a sense of amateurism, the idea of the amateur pianist, the amateur artist, the amateur scholar in a way, or intellectual, precisely because he was worried about where a professional mindset or becoming too professionalized would take us. I'll come back to this. So, as you may know, but it's often forgotten, Edward Said grew up in Cairo. And although he was born and baptized in Jerusalem, it was Cairo that was the anchor of his childhood, according to his biographer. What, we can ask, was Said's North Africa? It was living as a minority within a minority. His family was Anglican within a Christian minority. But the family was wealthy due to his father's selling stationery and office supplies to the occupying British Army. Perhaps as a result already of these paradoxes, where someone who grew up funded by the profits of selling to the occupying forces would become one of our most important post-colonial theorists. Said had this tremendous ability to think through tensions or contradictions as themselves productive. What I found so helpful in writing this book were, in particular, Said's lesser known writings, or in a way, his more political writings about human rights, humanism, self determination, and dispossession. As if some of you have studied Said, you, I would guess, have studied his book Orientalism from 1978, and maybe his sort of sequel to Orientalism, Culture and Imperialism from 1993. But less and less often, at least in the context where I live and work, do we study his book from 1979, The Question of Palestine, and from 1994, The Politics of Dispossession. I don't know your reading list exactly in global studies or decolonial theory at Freiburg, but most often in academic life still, in terms of the reading list I have seen, we're more likely to read Orientalism and Culture and Imperialism than we are to read The Question of Palestine and The Politics of Dispossession. It is true that Said played a role in introducing some of what we now call theory, most broadly into the academy, Derrida and Foucault, into academic fame. But he would also, in his later work, in this lesser known work, advance a strong critique of theory, of post-structuralism, comparing it to checking into a private resort and avoiding political life. So in his less academic, more political books, if I can put it this way, or his less professional books in some ways, you could say he maintained these concepts that theory and post-structuralism has asked us to interrogate and often to abandon: the humanity, human rights, sovereignty, self-determination, this grand emancipatory vocabulary of the 20th century that has become out of fashion in a way in lots of spaces in academic theory now. Why, we can ask, would Said keep these terms? Why would he defend these terms? I think part of an answer, in addition to his amateurism, is his commitment that intellectual life needs to be public life. He was always against insularity, hermeticism, against closing down dialogue, which a specialist vocabulary can do. He wanted writing that was worldly, meaning not just international or planetary, but also writing that was engaged, concrete, outward-oriented, and accessible, more toward the world as it is lived, less toward some rarefied sphere of being smart. Said saw in academic critical theory a discourse that was becoming more and more isolated, more and more incestuous, and thus losing a political edge it once might have had. And I found returning to these political books insightful and helpful in my own context in the North American Academy, where some forms of decolonial research, which is becoming an expanding heading of sorts. Many projects have limited connection to land or political struggle in community or international work, like what you all are trying to do. And instead, it seems to me we are often seeing more and more attempts to show how some concepts and authors are connected to imperialism, and then arguing that that concept or author is no longer useful for our projects. This is a method of rejection more than one of reconstruction. And the position I start from in Another Humanity, by great contrast, is that all concepts at this point are entangled with colonial histories. This is a method I learned from studying Said's political books, where he leverages our most powerful, if flawed, if contaminated, but still powerful, widely legible concepts. And I think this is also a philosophical method he maintained in a wider sense of philosophy as a way of life, as he navigated his youth in Cairo, his family's entanglements with British rule, his US citizenship, his elite education, all while living in different forms of exile and insisting that location is not determining for a person or a concept, and that filiation is never as important as affiliation, meaning aligning with those who invite us to stand by them and those with whom we choose to stand by in turn. So in this book, against the grain of some contemporary critical theory and decolonial theory, I defend the concepts of the human, humanity, and human rights. I defend them despite their limitations in colonial histories and the ongoing hierarchies they can perpetuate. These concepts remain widely legible starting points for conversation and action. And I see that legibility, which is, of course, tied to their contamination, if you think in that way, as a strength for a wider conversation. And in keeping my faith, in a way, in these concepts, I read 5 philosophers who also kept an idea of the human: Du Bois, Delisson, Winter, Said, and Arendt. Let me just put this one other way before I move to a different point. There was an influential article a few years ago by Nelson Maldonado Torres on the coloniality of being. And some have taken this thesis that we are living in a time of the coloniality of being, this absolute saturation of coloniality, to pursue research projects showing how a concept is in fact colonial and trying to avoid it, or searching for uncontaminated concepts, people, something like this. And I think the opposite approach is, in a way, more empowering. If we are living in this time of the coloniality of being, then we can quit looking for uncontaminated concepts and places. And instead, the project becomes more strategic, to use Stuart Hall's language. So this, for me, is the influence of Said on the book, to defend the concepts we have in our political lives now, and to see how impure this conceptual landscape we're living in still is. But to defend these concepts, to read them in new ways, to use them to raise consciousness of this moment we're living in all of our material entanglements. Just as an example, I'll read a longer quotation about how Said talked about human rights in his book, Reflections on Exile. He said, "To be for human rights means, in effect, to be willing to venture interpretations of those rights in the same place and with the same language employed by the dominant power, to dispute its hierarchy and methods, to elucidate what it has hidden, to pronounce what it has silenced or rendered unpronounceable. These intellectual procedures require, above all, an acute sense not of how things are separated, but of how they are connected, mixed, involved, embroiled, linked." Okay, what else is there to say as I begin to conclude this little talk and we move to more conversation. I want to just reference another lecture Said gave years ago. It's about a 30-minute lecture you can find online with the radio station KPFA. It's called something like KPFA, Edward Said on the Idea of Palestine. But this is a key idea he gives us, and it expands how we think about some of these questions. It's an echo of some of the book, The Question of Palestine. But he says something very interesting, that the question of Palestine is about land, yes, of course, but it's also about something else. He says, quote, "It is an idea, not simply about land. It is about land. It is about the right of people to their homeland, to national self-determination. But it is also," he goes on, "not about exclusion. It's about living community, about living in a human community of equality. It is about living together in a part of the world that is saturated with blood, and yet the idea goes on," end quote. So it's thinking with this idea, not only with Palestinian colleagues, but also with what Said calls the idea of Palestine, that I end the book returning to my own context in the United States, thinking about this idea as a point of orientation. And I hope that in reading the book, you will not only travel with me to these places I discuss, but also return to your own context, asking questions about not only what concepts don't work for you, but also about what does work strategically in your political struggles. In other words, I don't expect everyone to agree with my argument about the utility of human rights and humanity as concepts, but I am interested in what you would say are the concepts helpful in your own situation. Okay, I want to just make one last point, because we're in Freiburg, and to talk a little bit more about Hannah Arendt. So recently, I've been thinking about her review from 1943 of Stefan Zweig's book, The World of Yesterday. And I don't know if y'all have read Zweig's memoir or Arendt's review of it, which is collected in that Arendt on Politics and Literature, something like this book. But it's a devastating review because she criticizes Zweig's lack of politics, saying more or less he just wanted to be famous or around people of fame as he pursued his literary excellence. Some of that's true. In Zweig's memoir, he has lines about his time studying at university quite freely, and then concluding his studies, he said, "And now I was outwardly free, and all the years up to the present have been devoted to one struggle, to remain equally free inwardly," end quote. This is what Arendt warns us about, splitting the public and the private spheres, focusing on inward life. She wanted instead conversations about politics, action in concert with others. Said asked a related question, equally critical of inward and private life, in his book, The Question of Palestine. He said, quote, "How many ex-politicians or actively engaged intellectuals still say privately that they are horrified by Israeli military policy and political arrogance, or that they believe the occupation, creeping annexation, and settlement of the territories is inexcusable, and yet say little or nothing in public where their words might have some effect," end quote. So Arendt and Said give us this task of speaking publicly. But Zweig also has a profound sense in his memoir of what artistic community, which I think is related to what Said called human community in terms of equality, can look like, even though Zweig, to some extent, always maintained the norms of bourgeois Vienna in which he grew up. About the freedom of Paris, he wrote in his memoir, "One could dress as one pleased." He praised the poets he encountered there because they were not ashamed to live frugally in return for the right to think and work freely and adventurously in the world of art. They had no telephone, No typewriter, no secretaries, he goes on about the poets. They avoided all mechanical tools, just as they did the intellectual apparatus of propaganda, end quote. And it was in Paris where Zweig met Rilke, who lived in lodging, simple and without ornament, creating places where one could feel at home. There were very few things around him, Zweig observed about one of Rilke's apartments in Paris, but flowers always shone in a vase or bowl, perhaps the gift of women, perhaps tenderly brought home by himself, end quote. This is the connection I want to end us with. I want to think about these larger forms of life in which we live. Arendt and Said, for me, are surely correct that how we live in our houses is not enough when we need to be speaking and acting in public together. Perhaps most of all right now, and against some of Arendt's own positions in regard to what Said called the question of Palestine. But as we do so, we are faced with different paths, different ways of living when we are not in the street, because writing publicly and marching can only, after all, take up so much of our time. And that leaves us with this question of forms of life. It leaves us with the question of intellectual friendship and what we ask of each other. It leaves us with the question of how professional and professionalized we make our whole lives, especially as we finish our degrees or finish being students. So it's here that I find Zweig's reflections on his student days so helpful, keeping alive his amateur sensibility, encouraging us to work on our art and writing in these humble, connected spaces in which we make others feel at home. How we connect our everyday lives to the wider public struggles we are facing and participating in now is the question I want to leave us with today. I look forward to the conversation. Thank you very much.